I handed my financial control over to my daughter-in-law when I was at my weakest following my surgery. What I received in return was not the care I expected, but a bright red electricity shut-off notice right in the middle of a sweltering North Carolina summer. Why would the person I trusted most in this world want to push me into such a state of misery? Hello to all my dear listeners. North Carolina has been a bit temperamental lately, and this heavy air really makes me miss those long afternoons sitting out on the porch with my Joe. Before I get into my journey of finding the light again, would you mind hitting that like button so we can stay connected? How are you all doing today? Is your health holding up? I truly hope every one of you is feeling at peace in the hands of the Lord. The story I am about to share began with a refusal that sounded so much like it was for my own good, but it was really the start of a bitter scheme to take what I had. Let us go back to that afternoon when Brenda had her suitcase packed tight and the doors to my heart started to close. The golden aroma of fresh cornbread was still thick in the air of my kitchen, a scent that usually meant family and warmth. I had spent the morning carefully packing away little snacks for the Alaska cruise Brenda had been planning for a month, thinking of how much the grandkids would love the views. I reached for my purse, clutching my bank card with a sense of pride, intending to give Steven some extra spending money so he could buy the babies those expensive souvenirs they always eye. My heart was full of the kind of excitement only a grandmother feels when a big family trip is finally here. But when I spoke up about the excursion, Brenda did not even look at me. She just stood there adjusting that expensive silk scarf around her neck, her voice coming out light and airy, yet colder than any Arctic breeze. She told me she thought it would be better if I stayed behind. She said the trip involved too much walking and that the ship would be too cramped for me, claiming I needed absolute rest after my recent surgery. My ears started ringing so loud, I could barely hear my own breathing. I stood there frozen as the words, "not enough space," bounced around the walls of the kitchen I had worked so hard to keep. Not enough space? That luxury suite and those tickets were paid for with the very account I had given her access to weeks ago. A sharp, stabbing pain flared in my chest and radiated down my arms, forcing me to grip the edge of the table just to keep from collapsing onto the linoleum floor. Brenda kept right on packing her bags, her face completely blank, acting like she was just deciding to toss out a piece of old, worn-out furniture instead of her husband's mother. She had no idea that in the moment she turned her back on me, my whole world, the one built on the idea of a loving family, had just crumbled into dust. Brenda walked out of the room with a self-satisfied smile, leaving me standing alone in the sudden silence of my kitchen. I looked down at the food I had prepared with so much love, and my heart felt like a lead weight in my chest. But that was not even the biggest shock of the day. As the sun began to set and the shadows stretched long across the floor, a terrifying stillness took over the house. It was not just the quiet of being alone. It was the sudden, jarring click of the power being cut off that made me realize the truth was much darker than a missed vacation. Sitting in the shadows with only the dim, flickering beam of a flashlight for company, I found myself staring at the old framed photographs on my wall, their edges yellowed by time and the humid Florida air. Each picture felt like a ghost of the woman I used to be. I remembered the 30 long years I spent at that textile mill, the endless night shifts where the roar of the machines became the only lullaby I knew. I did it all for Steven. I wanted him to have the college degree I never could, and the kind of lavish wedding with Brenda that would be the talk of the neighborhood. I gave them more than just a mother's love. I handed over $50,000, every cent of the savings Joe and I had scraped together, just so they could buy their first home. When my health took a turn and I had to go under the knife for that surgery, I signed over the power of attorney because I trusted them more than I trusted myself. I always believed that if I poured enough into them, I would find warmth and care in my sunset years. But the cold truth was starting to settle in my bones. Brenda was only ever sweet to me when my bank card was still swiping. The sadness that had been weighing me down began to burn off, replaced by a slow, simmering anger that tasted like ash in my mouth. I started replaying the scenes in my head, seeing the moments I had been too blind to notice before. I remembered how Brenda would rush me to sign those estate planning documents, flipping the pages so fast I never got a chance to read the fine print. A terrifying pattern finally emerged from the fog. Every time she bought me a new pair of comfortable Skechers or that Kindle Paperwhite, she said would help my tired eyes, a massive, unexplained withdrawal would vanish from my account just a few days later. She used those small gifts like a distraction while she picked my pockets clean. I had been so blinded by the idea of family that I let her walk all over me. But enough is enough. I could not sit by and watch a lifetime of Joe's hard work and my own sacrifices disappear into whatever frivolous games or vanity she was chasing. By the time the sun began to peek through the blinds the next morning, I was no longer that defeated woman, waiting for the lights to come back on. I stood up and smoothed out my dress, a cold and steady determination taking root in my gaze. The time for tears was over. I needed to see the hard numbers and find out exactly what Brenda had done with my life's work. My first stop would be the bank in the center of town, and I knew exactly which questions I needed to ask. I chose my favorite Talbot's dress, the one I usually save for Sunday morning service, and slipped into my most comfortable pair of Clark's shoes. As I began my walk toward the bus stop, the North Carolina sun felt warmer and brighter than it had in a long time. Even with the weight on my spirit, the fresh air was a blessing. In this 2025 economy, with prices at the grocery store climbing higher every week, and all the confusing talk about changes to Medicare, I knew I could not afford to let a single dollar go to waste. I decided to stop at my local cafe first, ordering a hot tea and just sitting there for a moment. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of peace, realizing I did not have to worry about whether Brenda approved of how I spent my morning or my money. When I reached the bank, I was helped by a young man named Marcus. He had a kind face and a gentle way of speaking that reminded me so much of my own grandson. I asked him to print out my statements from the last 6 months, and as I looked over the pages, my heart just sank. There were rows and rows of large cash withdrawals from ATMs right near the Harrah's Cherokee Casino. Brenda had looked me in the eye and told me that money was going toward fixing the leak in my roof. But as I sat there, I realized my roof was just as broken as it had been, while my hard-earned savings had been tossed away on a gambling floor. A wave of relief washed over me because I finally knew the truth, and it gave me the strength to tell Marcus I wanted to revoke her power of attorney immediately. I walked out of that bank, clutching my folder tightly, feeling a sense of freedom I thought I had lost forever. I felt stronger with every step I took back toward my house. But I knew deep down that Brenda would not just walk away quietly once she realized her easy access to my life was gone. The moment I stepped through my front door and set my bag down, the phone on the kitchen table began to vibrate. I did not even have to look at the screen to know it was her. My dear listeners, have you ever felt like you were becoming invisible in your own home? Like your voice did not matter anymore? Please leave a comment saying, "Strong?" if you believe that we always have that inner spark to stand up and protect ourselves. I would also love to hear if any of you have been taking your daily walks in the park lately to enjoy the fresh air and clear your mind. The phone ringing on the side table startled me just as I was settling into my lazy boy recliner, trying to find some peace in a book on my Kindle. It was Brenda. My heart did a nervous little skip because I knew that ringtone usually meant someone wanted something. But when I answered, Her voice was dripping with a sweetness I had not heard in a long time. She started cooing about how much she worried about me, asking if I was lonely in that big house all by myself after the surgery. I gripped the edges of my Kindle until my knuckles turned white, taking a long, slow breath to steady my shaking hands. I had heard this song before. It was the same melody she played every time she was setting the stage for a favor. I kept my voice as smooth as Sunday morning coffee, telling her I was doing just fine and thanking her for checking in. Deep down, my stomach was doing backflips, but I told myself to stay sharp because I knew the real reason for this call was buried just beneath her kind words. Sure enough, it did not take long before the conversation turned toward the world outside my front door. Brenda began to sigh heavily, rambling on about how hard things had become in this 2025 economy. She talked about how the sky-high inflation was eating their paychecks alive and making it impossible to keep up with the kids' tuition and the daily cost of living. She brought up the new tariffs and how the price of everything from groceries to gas was just plain ridiculous these days. Then she carefully pivoted, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper as she mentioned that old leak in my roof again. She told me she had finally found a contractor who could fix it for a good price, but he needed a small deposit from my savings right away to hold the spot. She was playing the part of the devoted daughter-in-law so well, acting like she was the only one willing to shoulder the burden of keeping my home together. I sat there listening, my mind flashing back to those bank statements Marcus had printed for me earlier that morning. I could still see the ink on the page clearly, the thousands of dollars pulled out at the casino ATMs near Harrah's Cherokee, while she was telling me she was taking care of my business. The sweetness in her voice felt like a thin veil over a very ugly truth. I did not raise my voice. I just spoke with a quiet, cold clarity that I did not know I still had in me. I told her that I had been to the bank and seen the accounts for myself. I told her I noticed the withdrawals that did not make any sense. And because of that, I had already locked the cards and revoked her power of attorney. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like it was pressing against my chest. I could hear her breathing getting fast and shallow on the other end. The sound of a person who had just run into a wall they never saw coming. For the first time in years, I felt a tiny spark of real confidence starting to glow in my heart. The sweetness vanished in an instant, replaced by a storm of tears and sharp accusations. She started crying loudly, telling me I was being cruel and that Stephen would be heartbroken to know I was treating his wife like a common thief. She even tried to turn it around on me, suggesting that maybe the anesthesia from my surgery had messed with my head and that I was just confused about the numbers. She said my memory was not what it used to be and that I was hurting the whole family with these crazy ideas. But I stayed firm, feeling like an old oak tree that was not about to bend in a little bit of wind. I told her my mind was as clear as a bell and that we would only have this conversation again when she was ready to tell me the honest truth. Before she could say another word or throw another hurtful accusation, I pressed the button and ended the call. After I hung up, I stayed in that chair for a long time, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had finally stepped out of that shadow of being the passive, quiet mother-in-law everyone expected me to be. I knew this was not the end of it. A woman like Brenda was not going to give up her hold on my life without a fight. The silence in the house felt different now, like the stillness right before a thunderstorm breaks over the horizon, and I knew I had to get ready for whatever was coming next. It had been less than an hour since that phone call ended when the jarring rattle of a key in the front door lock made me jump in my seat. Brenda did not knock or announce herself. She just barged in like she owned the place. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She did not even say hello before she started screaming. asking me what on earth I thought I was doing as she slammed her designer handbag onto my coffee table with enough force to make my teacup rattle. I stood up slowly in the middle of my living room, smoothing down my Talbot's dress and praying she could not see how much my legs were shaking. I looked her right in the eye and told her as calmly as I could that this was my home, and she did not have the right to just storm in with a key I never gave her permission to use for this purpose. She let out a short, nasty laugh, the kind of mocking sound I had never heard from her in all the 10 years she had been married to my son. She looked at me with pure contempt, telling me it was ridiculous to call it my house when I was supposedly too old and too confused to even take care of it anymore. She stepped closer, invading my personal space and backing me toward the wall as she hissed that Stephen was going to be the one on the deed sooner rather than later anyway. The fear that had been fluttering in my chest suddenly flickered out, and in its place, a hot flame of anger began to roar to life. This was my dignity she was stepping on, the very life I had built with my own 2 hands, and I realized I was done hiding like a timid victim. For the first time in my life, I let every bit of the hurt and resentment I had been carrying pour out of me. I reminded her of the 30 years I spent on those hard floors at the textile mill, working double shifts and coming home with aching bones just so Stephen could have a college education and a life better than mine. I reminded her of the $50,000 I had handed over to them without a second thought, just so they could have a roof over their heads. I asked her how she could take all that love and all that hard-earned money only to turn around and betray me by throwing it away on those gambling tables at the Harrah's casino. My voice was shaking with the weight of it all, but it was steady and strong, echoing off the walls of the room. Brenda froze for just a second, the shock of me knowing her secret written all over her face. But then she doubled down on her aggression to hide her guilt. She started shouting that I was talking nonsense and that the money had been spent on the roof repairs just like she said. She started calling me senile and told me I was losing my mind, her breath hot with fury as she stood over me. To make me feel even more helpless, she reached out and swiped my glasses and my walking cane off the side table, tossing them across the room where I could not easily reach them. She yelled that the property was going to be the kids' inheritance anyway, and asked why I was being so greedy as to hold on to it when I was just going to take it to the grave with me. Those words were like poisoned needles stabbing into my heart, coming from someone I had treated like a daughter. That was the moment my patience finally snapped. I did not feel like a frail old woman anymore. I felt the strength of my husband Joe and the pride of 30 years of honest, backbreaking labor rising up in me. I pointed my finger straight at the door and told her to get out of my house right that second. I told her if she did not leave immediately, I was calling the police to report her for trespassing and for the way she was mistreating me. I had never raised my voice like that in this house, and the sound of it seemed to startle even Brenda. She looked at me with wide eyes, clearly shocked that the quiet, gentle grandmother she thought she could control was finally standing her ground. She curled her lip in a sneer and grabbed her bag, but she did not leave without one last cold threat. She told me to just wait and see, claiming that Stephen would never take my side over hers. She spat out that I would soon regret treating my only family this way, acting as if I was the one who had caused all this pain. Then she walked out and slammed the front door so hard that the pictures of our family on the hallway wall actually rattled on their nails. I sank down onto the sofa, my body feeling like lead and every muscle aching from the adrenaline. But underneath the exhaustion, there was a new and strange feeling of being unbreakable. I sat there in the quiet North Carolina twilight as the shadows grew long across the carpet, waiting for my breathing to return to normal. That confrontation had stripped away the last of my illusions and confirmed what I had been too scared to admit. Brenda was consumed by greed, and she would not hesitate to crush me to get what she wanted. I knew there was no going back to the way things were, and I realized I had to move fast if I wanted to protect what Joe and I had spent our lives building. A plan began to take shape in my mind, a way to build a wall around my life that she could not tear down. The next morning, I did not wake up feeling like a victim who wanted to hide under the covers and cry. I woke up with a clear purpose and a fire in my eyes. I knew I needed experts who actually understood the law and cared about people in my position. My first stop of the day was not going to be my usual trip to Walmart or Target for groceries. Instead, I was heading straight to the office of an attorney who specialized in elder law, because I was ready to fight for my life. I started my day by reaching out to a professional lawyer who was recommended to me by the sisters in my church circle. Sitting in that sun-drenched office, I laid out every detail of my life savings, the deed to my home, and the way Brenda had been handling my affairs. The lawyer just nodded with such a deep, quiet understanding, helping me realize that protecting my hard-earned money was not a selfish act, but an act of self-respect. We got straight to work opening new bank accounts at a completely different institution, effectively cutting every tie to the old accounts Brenda had used to pick my pockets. It felt like a heavy weight was finally being lifted off my shoulders as I watched those new documents being printed. Next came the physical protection of my sanctuary. I called a locksmith to come out and change every single lock on the front door, the back door, and even those old basement windows. Hearing the solid, heavy click of those new deadbolts felt so reassuring, like a firm statement that this was my territory again. I also had a Ring security camera system installed, so I could keep an eye on things right from my phone. Now, if anyone even steps onto my porch, I get an alert immediately, giving me back a sense of control over who comes into my life. I do not have to jump every time I hear a floorboard creak anymore. On the digital side of things, I went through and changed every single password for my email and the news sites I like to read. I blocked Brenda's number and all her social media pages too. It felt a little lonely at first, seeing that empty contact list. But then a huge wave of relief washed over me because I knew I would not have to wake up to any more manipulative messages or threats from her. I spent some time gathering all my important papers and putting them into a small safe, which I tucked away secretly behind the non-slip mats in the bathroom where no one would ever think to look. I even started learning how to use some of those money management apps on my Kindle. I took a good look at my 2025 Medicare benefits to make sure I was not losing any coverage with all the recent policy changes and rising costs going on. Truly understanding where I stood financially made me feel so much stronger and more independent. I was not just a grandmother waiting for someone to ask for money anymore. I was a woman with a real, solid plan for her own future. I spent the whole afternoon out in the yard, getting some fresh air and planting new flowers I picked up from Home Depot to brighten up the place. Those little tasks helped me turn my fear into something meaningful and productive. Every flower I put in the ground felt like a promise to myself that my life would bloom again, no matter what kind of storm had just passed through my living room. I could feel that sense of safety slowly creeping back into every corner of my home as I worked in the soil. While I was working, I happened to find Joe's old music player tucked away in a drawer. Those soft jazz melodies filled up the quiet rooms, and it felt like a healing balm for my soul. The music helped me stay focused on my own peace, instead of the chaos Brenda was trying to cause. I realized then that building these defenses was not just about keeping people out. It was about creating a quiet space where I could actually enjoy the years I have left. As the day came to an end, I stood on my porch and looked up at the North Carolina night sky. I did not feel like a helpless victim anymore. with a good lawyer on my side, a modern camera system, and a safe bank account, I was ready for whatever Brenda tried next. I walked inside, locked the door, and for the first time in months, I fell into a deep and peaceful sleep. But the best kind of protection does not always come from a lock or a bank account. Sometimes it comes from the people right next door. Just as I was starting to think I could handle it all on my own, a gentle knock from a kind neighbor changed everything. Mrs. Miller, the sweet lady who has lived right next door to me for over 20 years, walked up my front porch carrying a plate of warm, homemade pie that smelled like heaven. She looked at me with those deep, worried eyes and told me she had heard all that ugly shouting from the other day. I invited her inside, and for the very first time, I let the walls down and told her the whole truth about how Brenda had been draining my hard-earned money behind my back. Mrs. Miller reached over and squeezed my hand so tight, telling me not to be afraid because she had actually seen Brenda sneakily loading my things into her car several times when she thought no one was watching. She looked me straight in the face and promised that if I ever needed someone to stand up and be a witness for me, she would be right there by my side. Not being all alone in this struggle anymore made me feel a wave of emotion I can barely describe. Right after that, my phone rang, and it was my dear friend Sarah, the one I used to stand next to for years back at the textile mill. Sarah has stayed busy with a local group that fights for the rights of seniors in our community, and she told me she had already been talking to her people about my situation. She told me loud and clear that they would be standing right behind me, whether I had to have a hard talk with Stephen or even if it meant going all the way to a courtroom. Getting that kind of fierce support from my sisters who have known me my whole life gave me a surge of strength that felt like a mountain. My belief in the goodness of people, which Brenda had tried so hard to tear down, was finally starting to find its way home. Sitting there in my living room with Mrs. Miller, sipping on some hot tea, I could feel a brand new energy filling up the space. We sat and talked about how our neighborhood and our church could do more to look out for other older folks who might be suffering in silence just like I was. I began to realize that by finally finding my voice, I was not just saving myself, but I was maybe helping to protect others too. This connection with my friends was like a spiritual fortress that no amount of Brenda's threats could ever hope to break through. I knew right then that I finally had all the strength I needed to keep moving forward. With my friends standing with me, I felt brave enough to take the next big step and finally start cleaning out that old storage room where my Joe used to keep all his treasures. And right there in the middle of all that dust and old memories, my hand brushed against something that was never meant to be found. A terrible secret Brenda had been trying to keep hidden in the dark for a very long time. My dear listeners, when things got the hardest for you, who was the person who reached out and held your hand? Please leave a little thank you or a heart in the comments to honor those good friends who show up when it matters most. And have any of you been heading down to the church lately to catch up and share your hearts with your sisters? While I was down in the basement clearing out stacks of old newspapers and cardboard boxes, I stumbled across a large envelope tucked away behind some dusty garden tools. When I pulled it open, my hand started trembling so hard the paper rattled. Inside were printed emails and text messages between Brenda and a stranger, discussing how to legally transfer my home to Stephen's name so she could sell it to cover her gambling debts. One line felt like a cold blade cutting right through me, where she wrote that the old lady would not last much longer anyway, and they needed to get that power of attorney signed before I caught on to what was happening. A wave of pure disgust washed over me as I realized how systematic this whole lie had been. Brenda did not just want my cash. She wanted to take away my last bit of shelter and the very legacy Joe had worked his whole life to leave behind. I even found a receipt from a local antique shop with Brenda's name on it, showing she had already sold Joe's precious stamp collection, the one thing I had been saving to give our grandson when he grew up. That betrayal went deeper than anything I could have ever imagined, and it wiped away any last hope I had of ever making peace with her. I took a long, deep breath to keep from falling over and used my phone to snap pictures of every single page of that evidence. Everything felt crystal clear in my mind now. All those strange looks and the way Brenda had been acting finally made sense. This was the secret weapon my lawyer needed to turn the tide in our favor. I sent the photos to him right then and there with a short note saying we finally had enough evidence. A cold, steady determination took over my heart, and I knew right then I was not a weak victim anymore. I sat there in the quiet shadows of that basement, looking at the empty box where those stamps used to be. The pain of losing those things started to harden into a spirit like steel. Brenda had made a huge mistake by underestimating a woman who had survived 30 years of backbreaking labor and a major surgery. I knew I had to act, not just for myself, but to protect Joe's honor and everything we had built together. The truth was out in the open now, and it was time for justice to finally do its work. Before I stepped into the final legal battle, I felt like I needed to find my center. I headed out to the cemetery on a windy afternoon to the place where Joe was resting. I needed to have one last talk with him to steady my soul before I faced the cruelty of what was coming next. I stood there in front of Joe's grave, carefully placing a bunch of the magnolias he always loved so much against that cold stone. Memories of our 40 years together started playing in my mind like an old movie on a slow Sunday afternoon. Those long walks we used to take along the beach, and the way his whole face would light up with a big laugh whenever he held our grandkids in his arms. I leaned in close and whispered that Brenda had sold off his stamp collection, and the hot tears just started pouring down my face. I felt so worn out after fighting this battle all by myself these past few days. But as I looked at his smiling face on that headstone, I could almost hear his deep voice comforting me, telling me to hang in there because I was still the strongest woman he ever knew. A strange, gentle warmth seemed to spread through my whole body, even though the North Carolina wind was biting at my skin. I realized right then that the honor of our family and the lessons about being a person of integrity Joe always taught me were the most precious things we had, things that no one could ever truly take away. I was not just fighting for the bank accounts or the house. I was fighting for justice and for a clean, honest future for my grandkids. All that heavy sadness started to lift, replaced by a deep sense of peace and a determination that felt like iron in my soul. I wiped my eyes and stood up straight, feeling the strength of my ancestors and my own roots flowing through me once again. As I walked away from the cemetery, the sky was painted in the most beautiful shades of orange and gold from the setting sun. It felt like Joe was walking right there next to me, giving me the courage I needed to keep putting one foot in front of the other. I knew exactly what I had to do now to protect his honor and all the hard work we both put in over those 30 years at the mill. The quietness of that place had healed my spirit and given me a kind of armor that nothing could break through. I was ready now for the hardest fight of all, even with the authorities Brenda was trying to use against me. But Brenda's attacks were not just about the money anymore. She was starting to play a much more cruel game, one that aimed right at my mental health. The very next morning, I heard a knock at my door, and when I opened it, I found a social worker standing there with a clipboard, telling me she was there to check on my sanity. The knock on my door that Tuesday morning was sharp and official, the kind that makes your heart drop into your stomach even when you have not done a single thing wrong. I opened it to find a woman from Adult Protective Services standing there with a heavy clipboard and a face that looked like it was carved out of granite. She told me her name was Agent Vance, and that her office had received an anonymous report claiming I was living in a state of cognitive decline and showing signs of self-neglect. I felt a surge of pure heat rush to my face as my dignity was stripped away right there on my own doorstep. Brenda had finally crossed a line I never thought she would touch, trying to paint me as some poor, confused soul just so she could swoop in and steal the keys to my life. I took a long, slow breath to steady my shaking hands, invited the woman inside, and made sure to hit the record button on my phone just like my lawyer had told me to do. I led her into my sun-drenched living room, which was as tidy and organized as it always was, and sat her down for a talk. I made sure to answer every single one of her questions with a voice that was clear and steady as a church bell. I walked her through my daily routine, listing off my blood pressure medication and the statins I take every morning through my Medicare plan without missing a single beat. I even pulled out my folder and showed her the utility bills that had been paid in full from my brand new account. I told her that despite what she might have heard, I was still cooking my own healthy meals and heading down to the church every single week to be with my sisters. As we talked, I could see Agent Vance's stern expression start to soften as she realized the woman sitting in front of her was not the messy, confused person described in that nasty report. When the agent finally leaned in and asked me if I ever felt like I was losing my grip or forgetting the little things, I just gave her a quiet, knowing smile. I reached over to my coffee table and laid out that thick envelope of bank statements I had found, showing the thousands of dollars Brenda had pulled out at the casinos. I told her straight out that I had not forgotten a single thing, and that these withdrawals were the real reason someone wanted the authorities to think I was not in my right mind anymore. The anger I felt was not the kind that makes you scream. It was a cold, heavy weight that gave my words a power I did not know I had. I was not just a victim making excuses. I was a woman with the cold, hard proof of a betrayal right there in my hand. Agent Vance looked over those messages and the receipts for Joe's sold stamps with a look of genuine shock on her face. She let it slip that Brenda's side had already been trying to set up a mental health evaluation with a private doctor they had chosen. I did not hesitate for even a second when I told her I was absolutely refusing to see any doctor they picked out for me. I told her I wanted an independent evaluation done at the big hospital in my Medicare network, and I made it clear my lawyer would be sitting right there beside me the whole time. That bit of backbone seemed to impress her, and she nodded her head like she was seeing me for who I really was. A woman who knew her rights and was not about to let anyone trample over them. We must have sat there for over 2 hours as I proved to her that I was completely aware of everything happening in the world, from the 2025 economic shifts to the new policies that were affecting us seniors. I even shared the details of how I had just managed my own shopping on Amazon to get a special neck pillow to help with my sleep, proving I could handle my own business just fine. That feeling of being small and helpless started to evaporate, replaced by the quiet victory of someone who had just won a very high-stakes game of wits. By the time she stood up to leave, Agent Vance told me the report was completely unfounded and that she would be filing a formal note about the false information that had been given to her office. When the door finally closed behind her, I felt a surge of strength that felt like it was coming from deep within my bones. Brenda had thrown her most cruel and dangerous card at me, trying to lock me away in some nursing home against my will, and she had failed miserably because I was ready for her. I felt like I had just walked through a fire and come out on the other side without a single singe. Every step I took across my hardwood floors felt solid and sure, the steps of a woman who had finally grabbed the reins of her own life again. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer to let him know how it went, and he sounded just as pleased as I was. He told me I had done a beautiful job and that this report would be a huge help to us when we finally had to stand in front of a judge. A real sense of safety started to wrap around me, stronger and more permanent than it had been in years. I sat out on my porch with a hot cup of tea, just breathing in the fresh air and enjoying the freedom in my own mind. I knew the final struggle was coming fast, but I also knew I was finally ready for the truth to be heard. But Brenda was not the type to just tuck her tail and run after one defeat. As soon as she realized her plan with the social services had fallen through, she went and filed a formal lawsuit to try and take the title of my house right out from under me. The day that court summons arrived in the mail, I knew I was down to the very last step of this long nightmare, and I was going to see it through to the end. My dear listeners, has anyone ever tried to tell you that you were losing your edge or your mind just because of the years on your face? Please leave a comment saying, "Wise to show that our minds are as sharp as they have ever been." And I would love to know if any of you have been heading over to the community center for those yoga or dance classes to keep yourselves moving and feeling good. I held the court summons in my hand, feeling the cold weight of the paper and the heartless look of those bold black letters staring back at me. Brenda was suing me, officially claiming that I no longer had the mental capacity or the common sense to manage my own home and my own money. It was a low blow, even for her, to try and label me as incompetent, just because she wanted to get her hands on the deed. But instead of that old, familiar fear shaking my bones, I felt a strange and quiet calm settle over my spirit. My lawyer and I spent hours sitting at my kitchen table, carefully going through every single piece of proof we had gathered. The records of those massive withdrawals from the casino ATMs, the receipts for Joe's precious stamp collection that she had no right to sell, and the official conclusion from the social worker who saw through her lies. We built our strategy brick by brick, making sure there was not a single hole left for her deceit to crawl through when we finally walked into that courtroom. Brenda's lawyer eventually reached out with what they called a settlement offer, but to me, it was nothing more than a final insult. They said I could stay in my house for the rest of my life, as long as I signed the title over to Stephen immediately so they could conveniently manage the property for me. It was a transparent attempt to wrap their greed in a blanket of fake kindness, hoping I would be too tired to keep fighting. They wanted to use my love for my son to finish the job they started. I told my lawyer to tell them no, absolutely not. I was not putting myself through all this stress for a pile of bricks or a bank account. I was fighting for the truth and for my right to make my own decisions for as long as God gives me breath. I refused to let them turn me into a guest in my own home, a home that Joe and I had paid for with 30 years of sweat and sacrifice. The night before the hearing, the house was so still I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the mantel, a sound that usually made me feel a bit lonely, but now just felt like a steady, reassuring heartbeat. I spent my time quietly ironing my best Talbot's dress, making sure every pleat was perfect and every wrinkle was gone. I could feel the heavy weight of the battle waiting for me the next morning, but my heart was surprisingly full of faith in the justice system. I had done everything a woman could do to prepare, and I had done it all with honor. I felt like a piece of steel that had finally been hardened in the fire, ready to stand my ground. I was not going in there as a victim. I was going in as a woman who had reclaimed her voice and her power. I took a long moment to look at the family photos on the wall, and for the first time in months, I felt a deep sense of relief because I had been brave enough to stand up. I knew my son Stephen was caught in a hard place, hurting because his life was being turned upside down. But I also knew this was a lesson he needed to learn about integrity and the weight of responsibility. I was no longer worried about whatever lies Brenda might try to spin in front of the judge, because I had the truth, the evidence, and the law standing right there behind me. I closed my eyes, took one last deep breath of the cool North Carolina air, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, knowing I was completely ready for the morning light. The courtroom was crowded, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and the nervous energy of people waiting for a verdict. Brenda sat at the table across from me, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and putting on the performance of a lifetime. She told the judge with a trembling voice that she was only acting out of love, claiming that I had started having hallucinations about our finances and that my mind was slipping away into a fog of confusion. But then my lawyer stood up, his movements calm and deliberate as he pulled out our secret weapon. When those printed emails detailing her plan to sell my home and the receipts from the antique shop where she pawned Joe's stamps appeared on the big screen, the color drained from Brenda's face until she looked like a ghost. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the room as the systematic nature of her deceit was laid bare for everyone to see. That knot of anxiety that had been tightening in my chest for months finally began to loosen, replaced by a quiet, steady sense of satisfaction. When it was my turn to speak, I stood before the judge with my head held high, my voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room with a clarity that surprised even me. I did not use angry words or sharp accusations. I simply told the story of my life. I spoke about the 30 years of sweat and toil I gave to that textile mill and the deep well of love I had poured into my family, only to have it used against me like a trap. I looked the judge in the eye and told him that while my bones might be older and my pace a little slower, my mind was still sharp enough to know the difference between a helping hand and a hand that was reaching into my pocket. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Stephen finally bow his head, his shoulders slumped with a shame that he could no longer hide. Brenda's lawyer tried one last desperate move, questioning my Medicare records and trying to make my blood pressure medication seem like proof of a failing mind. But my lawyer was ready, cutting him off with the independent medical reports from the hospital that proved I was as healthy and sane as anyone in that room. One by one, every single lie Brenda had spun was peeled back like old wallpaper, revealing the ugly truth underneath. I felt a surge of triumph watching her tremble as the weight of her own actions finally caught up to her. I took a deep breath, feeling the undeniable power of integrity winning out over the shadows of greed. The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the wood was the most beautiful music I had heard in years. He did not mince words as he delivered his final judgment, completely dismissing Brenda's request for guardianship and declaring me fully capable of handling my own life. He ordered her to pay back every single cent she had taken from Joe's collection and the casino withdrawals, and he gave her a scolding that made the whole room go still, calling her behavior toward an elder both shameful and heartless. A wave of relief so powerful it felt like a physical force washed over me. And for the first time in a very long time, the tears falling down my face were born of pure, unadulterated happiness rather than heartbreak. As the security officers escorted Brenda from the room, she still had that bitter, hang-hawk look on her face, refusing to show even a hint of regret. I stood up and felt the warm, solid hugs of Sarah and Mrs. Miller, their presence a reminder that I had never truly been as alone as I felt. Stephen eventually made his way over to me, his voice cracking as he mumbled an apology and looked me in the eye for the first time in weeks. My heart still ached for my son, but I knew in my soul that I had done the right thing for both of us. The heavy burden I had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted, and I felt lighter than I had since the day Joe passed away. Walking out of that courthouse into the bright midday sun, the whole world seemed to have changed colors. The air tasted sweeter, and the sky looked a more vibrant shade of blue now that the storm had finally passed. I was not a victim anymore. I was a woman who had fought for her life and won. All the tension and the sleepless nights evaporated into the warm North Carolina air, replaced by a fierce and beautiful hope for the quiet, independent life that was waiting for me. The battle was over, and it was finally time for me to start living for myself again. I spent that evening in the quiet of my own home, bowing my head in a prayer of deep gratitude to the Lord for guiding me through the darkness. I realized then that standing up for myself had not just saved my house or my bank account. It had saved my very spirit and my self-respect. I sat out on my porch under the twinkling stars, feeling a gentle breeze on my face and knowing deep down that Joe was smiling down on me from heaven. That long, painful chapter of my life was finally closed tight, and I was more than ready to open up a brand new one that would be full of peace and the simple joy of being free. A few months after the court case wrapped up, I made the big decision to sell that old house. It held too many heavy memories of all that shouting and manipulation, and I knew I needed a fresh start to truly heal. I moved into a lovely little active senior living community in a much quieter state where the air just feels lighter and the neighbors always have a kind word to share. I spent my first week decorating my new place with bright, beautiful flowers I picked up from Lowe's, and I keep my Kindle Paperwhite right by the window so I can enjoy my books in the morning sun without a single distraction. I have joined a knitting club where we spend more time laughing than we do stitching. And every now and then, I take my grandkids on a trip to the beach or the mountains just because I want to and because I can. There is no one looking over my shoulder or trying to tell me what to do with my own life anymore. I am finally tasting what true freedom feels like, chasing after all those little dreams I had to set aside for years while I was busy looking after everyone else. To all my dear sisters out there listening, I want to tell you this from the bottom of my heart. Please do not ever let your love and sacrifice become an excuse for someone else to walk all over you. You have worked too hard and given too much of your soul to be treated like you do not matter in your own home. Keep a close eye on your own money. Set your boundaries firm like an old oak tree, and never be afraid to call a lawyer or ask for help if things do not feel right. We are strong, capable women, and we have every right to live our later years in peace and with the absolute respect we have earned through a lifetime of labor. My story is proof that whether you are 68 or well over 70, it is never too late to take the reins of your own life back from someone who is mistreating you. Stay as bright and as resilient as a beautiful magnolia bloom in the spring, because you are worth every bit of a brand new, joyful beginning. Thank you for sharing this time with me. It means so much to have you here. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with a sister who needs to hear it. We are never alone when we stand together. Stay strong, keep your light shining, and stay blessed until next time.